This is the Anthropology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anthropology Podcast. Joining me today from Washington, D.C., I have Dr. David Braun. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Yeah, thanks for inviting me on. I'm excited to be here.
I'm very excited to have you here. You are out of George Washington University, which is really cool. I took some classes there a very long time ago, and sometimes I really miss DC. Every once in a while, I'll be watching just like terrible TV, and there'll be that like kind of panning shot that shows like the Lincoln Memorial or like the GW Bridge, and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember being stuck in traffic there.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of TV shows now that have DC as a backdrop, so it's not. Yeah, when I'm not here, I like watching them to remind myself of how beautiful the city can be. So
for sure. I think the thing that always cracks me up, because there are a lot of shows set in DC, is when they're like, oh, we're here in Alexandria and now we're in Quantico. It only took us 20 minutes to get here. Or they drive up somewhere and they just park, and I'm like, what?
Nobody does that. If you on the red line, it's going to take you at least 45 minutes.
Oh my gosh. And then things just like, they just like shut down. There's like a website called Is the Metro on Fire? And it just scrapes Twitter, and you go into it and it just says yes or no.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is very accurate.
Anyway, Washington, D.C., shining light of America.
Sitting on a hill.
Here I am in Oakland, California. It's raining here, which we really need, which is very exciting. And that actually kind of does lead me into why I have you here, which is because you study a lot of things, but like kind of the confluence of climate, human behavior, and then how human behavior might shape ecosystems, and then how the changes in ecosystems might change climate, and it kind of all feeds into each other. And then you also look at tool use, which is really cool. And we've never talked about tool use on this show. It's all been like, how does the tool use affect the bones? It's never been, what about the tools?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I always thought is super interesting is that even though behavior is sometimes considered, like you said, a product of evolution or result, that because behavior is so much more adaptable, and we have lots of examples of species that do behaviors that are very different from what they're clearly adapted to, that it really is that behavior kind of is the sort of leading edge of evolution, right? In the sense that tool use and or other behaviors can modify a species sort of ecological niche, and then that leads to subsequent evolutionary pressures. And that's certainly, I think, what's happening with humans is, the sort of the ability for humans to use tools to transmit information with high fidelity, and to sort of kind of combine all that in a what's sometimes called sort of cultural niche construction, is really kind of what defines us as a species, right? The way in which we can amass technology, use it to modify our surroundings to get access to and to defray other sort of evolutionary pressures, is really kind of the reason why we're not, a very limited number of primates sitting somewhere in the tropics and exist all over the planet, and unfortunately sometimes in space. So, that inflection point is really when we see that humans are able to amass that information and trade it between individuals. So in that sense, I think that, kind of a defining feature of what is humans really is that ability to use tools and the ability to modify their environment. And unfortunately, it is an interesting but also so encompassing concept that it brings in so many different fields to really be able to do it, that it is sometimes becomes unwieldy to kind of wrap your head around a specific question or make actual progress on any one of them.
For sure. I think that you've actually like pulled on a bunch of different things here. One is, humans' effect on the environment, right? Which we're going to get more
Hmm.
into later. But I think that a
Hmm.
lot of people think about humans' effect on the environment, and they really think about it starting with the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
But a lot of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, just in
Yeah.
case anyone's curious about the
Yeah.
industrial, just get on Wikipedia. The article's not bad. Um, don't tell any of my old professors I said that. But you're talking about humans affecting environments. You're talking about it in like the deep past, which is super
Mhm.
interesting. And I think the other thing that you've pulled on too is that anthropology and this kind of research isn't something that can be done in a vacuum. It's something that does require the collaboration and contribution of a bunch of different fields to really understand what you're looking at.
Mm.
Because it's not like humans in the deep past were sitting around being like, you know what, let me just write down everything and I'll just leave it here for someone to find.
Yes, absolutely. And indeed, some portions of this kind of concept where it's like, okay, well, if we want to know how humans affected the environment, we just need to know what the environment looked like. Well, but that's an entire field into itself, right? So paleoecology, paleoclimatology, paleo environments is a tremendous set, and luckily for us, really well developed science. So, even though we are sort of consumers of that information, it is in and of itself not always settled. Sort of what did the sort of external to human environment look like, and so you have to be able to try to find a way to incorporate that information in a way that's useful for understanding questions about humans, but also understand that, as with everything in science, there's no one answer, right? There's a constant dialogue and discourse, and you have to try to understand, okay, well, how can I take information here and be true to the nature of, we don't know exactly how the environment is, but we know it's somewhere between here and here because of the proxies that we have for that information. So yeah, so incorporating all those different strands is probably the most, I find the most interesting thing, because even though we as academics end up in our silos, right? Our academic silos, like I'm in the Department of Anthropology, and people end up in biology or geology. The real interesting part is when you can mix the two of them, right? Is the building bridges across them to see things you wouldn't see otherwise. And I think that is really what I find the most interesting and exciting is, just forgetting about the constructions and the previous preconceived notions that my own field has developed about sort of, let's say, human history, and saying, okay, well, what can we see from ecology, or if we look into, one of the things that I got really excited about with this project in South Africa is the history of fire on the planet is astounding. The amount of research that has gone into where fires are, how intense they are, how forest fires happen, how that has changed over time, and how that really structures ecosystems. Geologists have done an amazing job at that, and archaeologists are only really just beginning to realize the different ways in which that can be tapped into to understand how humans impact fire in the past and the present, in a ways that, you living in California know more than I, are really relevant for the modern system.
Yeah, for listeners who are outside the country, California burns down 2 or 3 times a year during fire season, just all of it. And the other
Yeah.
thing I just wanted to say real quick is that you mentioned South Africa, and before the show we were chatting a little bit about this article, this review article that you wrote about ecosystem engineering in the quadrant area of the west coast of South Africa, and that's kind of what we're referring to
Mm.
throughout this paper, or throughout this chat, I should say. And you've done quite a bit of work in South Africa. You even taught there for a few years.
Yeah, so I was very lucky to be a faculty member at the University of Cape Town for 6 years, and was my first post there, and was a time when I, also was able to really get influenced by a tremendous number of scholars at the University of Cape Town working on the sort of ecosystems, and because UCT is a sort of still the sort of British style, there's still a Department of Zoology and Environmental and Geographic Systems. Is a really great group of people working there, and so it also got me to start to think outside of the strict realms of archaeology. And we did. sort of standard archaeology excavations at a site called Yellowstone in South Africa for about 8 to 10 years. And although we amassed a lot of rocks and bones, and it was a ton of fun, really I had enjoyed my time there. You were left with this feeling of like, if I'm going to answer big questions, I need more than this. And that's when we started working with a lot of different colleagues, and it's been really daunting because there's so much data, but it's not in the right shape you need it to really answer questions immediately. And then one of the things that's a big part of that paper that I think is really coming into its own and is, I think, really important for us as archaeologists is that we tend to develop hypotheses about the past based on our own interpretations of a sort of modern amount of time. Like we can go and watch hunter gatherers and we can see how they do things. And we can think, okay, this place they did one thing, this place they did another thing. But it's very hard for you to conceptualize the idea of this landscape I'm looking at now, what happens to it over a million years, right? Because that's what we're digging up. What we're digging up is just bits and pieces left behind over a million years. And what is the cumulative effect of a fire here, a fire there, a fire there, and every once in a while those become large forest fires? What is the cumulative effect of a record of that information over a million years? And that's where in that review paper we talk a lot about agent-based modeling, which I don't know how to do myself, but I have lots of great colleagues who do. And you know, it does a little bit seem like you're playing Sim City with ancient hominins, and maybe that's a reference that I just dated myself quite severely. But you're not trying to simulate the past. What you are trying to figure out is what are the parameters that if I change this, does it change everything else? Right? And so you want to try to figure out like what are the parts of this system that I haven't actually investigated, but actually have a tremendous influence. And I will say that people who actually work on the California coast in the last 10,000 years have done a tremendous amount of this work, really interesting stuff on coastal ecosystems and how, humans, even small groups of hunter gatherers, they don't have to, be tremendous predators to really have significant impacts on ecosystems. All they have to do is target a specific species, even, shellfish or even, a secondary predator, and it really shifts the whole ecosystem around. And that was the kind of thing that we were looking into. Why is it that west coast of South Africa, if I were to, put you in a teleporter and shoot you there a million years ago, would have buffalo, would have eland, would have a tremendous number of all these really big herbivores. And today, if I drop you there, people have tried to do that, they've translocated buffalo there, and if you don't feed them, they die, right? So, what is it about that ecosystem? Because when we look at the vegetation and things like that, they kind of look generally the same. What happens, or what's the difference between those two places a million years ago and now? And what is the sort of interface between humans and their role in that place?
For sure. I think one of the things too that when we think about climate change,
Mhm.
which we think about a lot, we think about humans in large groups and modern groups making these like big wide sweeping changes. But your point is that even in the ancient past, like most people don't tend to sit around and think of like, oh yeah, hunter gatherers, like they are affecting their ecosystem. People think of it in a very like kind of like naturalistic way, like, oh, they just slot into the
Mhm.
ecosystem and everyone just vibes together in like this
Yeah, yeah.
peaceful way. But like realistically, anytime you're in an environment, you're affecting that environment.
Mhm.
And like you said, like with one particular, if you target one particular species, like it can affect the whole ecosystem. A more quote unquote modern example from your perspective is
Yeah.
the settlers at Jamestown.
Mhm. Yeah.
They just like demolished a ton of the shellfish, especially the oysters that were in the Chesapeake Bay, which had long-term
Mhm.
consequences for the Chesapeake Bay
Mhm.
and all of the other species that lived there.
Mhm.
There's all of these historical accounts of just like mounds of shellfish shells of oyster
Yeah.
shells. And in fact, if you do any archaeological digs there, I guarantee you will find just like middens full of shells. And in
Yeah.
fact, a lot of places use shells to this day to like line paths and stuff.
Hmm.
And that's just one species that had far-reaching consequences, and that was 300 years ago. So
Hmm.
it's you don't need guns and coal factories
Yeah, exactly.
to make
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
changes.
There are conservation components to this too, because quite oftentimes people are just like, we want to return to the sort of naturalistic state, and you're like, well, there is no naturalistic state, right? We have been influencing the ecosystems that we live in, for better or for worse, but we have been a part of them for millions of years, right? And anytime, humans, because we're so adaptable and because we have such a big footprint in any ecosystem, we are always going to have an impact. And that impact may not, like as you said, may not look as global as the one that we see now, but all it takes is I mean, sometimes you think about, and shellfish is a great example. Yes, settlers had a huge impact in it, and then that was just ramped up later on to the point where huge amounts of the sort of coastal ecosystems on the mid Atlantic coast are completely forever modified because of the fact that you remove shellfish. These are keystone species for keeping water clean, for modifying what kind of fish can live in them, right? And so something like the Chesapeake is not never going to be the same at once we've removed something like, like you said, I think it's 85% of the shellfish that were there previously. And that kind of thing has been happening. I mean, if you look in coastal South Africa, huge middens that go back 10,000 years. But people are heavily, heavily invested in these resources that are centralized and that can be accessed relatively easily. And so, those have impacts on those ecosystems. And that's the kind of thing that we were sort of interested in. We were interested in how you can document what sometimes we call trophic cascades, where you basically modify one predator or one prey species and it rearranges the ecosystem. We were interested if we could find some of those in the deep past. And one of the ways we thought about doing it is looking at it in the Holocene first, where the time frames are a little bit easier. Right? When we look in the deep past, we're looking at millions of years. So even changes that happen over thousands of years, it's pretty hard for us to actually know, what came first, what came second, that kind of thing. But if we could identify it in the last 10,000 years, maybe we could then see what would that look like reiterated over thousands and thousands of times. So yeah, I mean that's a great example of the shellfish on the coast of the Middle Atlantic coast. Another one is a really great study that was done even recently, was actually looking at carbon isotopes from the animals that were hunted by Roosevelt when he did safaris in East Africa. And the great thing about those studies is that they were done with photographs, right? So you can see this is the animal and then the ecosystem it lived in. And one of the things you can see is that the world right now has a lot more trees in it in some places than it used to. And that's because we've removed a lot of the herbivores, right? So removing the herbivores that would usually damage the trees has allowed a lot of these trees to expand much further, right? So a consequence of something that we sort of don't think about is we always think about like, oh, we should plant more trees and that's the sort of the naturalist ecosystem. But in fact, actually, there are far more of them in some places than there used to be because the herbivores that used to knock them down or keep them at bay aren't around anymore. So those are the kinds of kind of ecosystem sort of unexpected events that we could start to look at in the deep past when you don't need to necessarily be a top predator to, even if you affect lower ends of the trophic ecosystem, that has consequences up the line in sort of predator prey relationships that have long-term consequences for the vegetation structure, right? And so piecing those things together, sometimes it ends up being just very theoretical, but it is the kind of thing that we're trying to get at.
For sure. So, listeners, just in case you don't remember like eighth grade biology, trophic levels are this idea that there are different levels in the environment. And at the bottom, like the bottom, it's like grass and like vegetation. And then you have animals that eat the grass and the vegetation. Those are typically prey animals. And then you have predators on top of that. This is, of course, a land-based system. In the ocean, it's a whole different thing that starts with like plankton or something like that. I don't really know that much about the ocean. Um, she says, sounding smarter and smarter every day. So taking just like one animal out of a trophic system can have huge long-term impacts. One of the things that I think is really interesting that you were talking about earlier is things that help define what humans are. And for a long time, we anthropologists talked about tool use as being a defining feature of humanity.
Mhm.
But as we've seen over time, there are a lot of primates. There are also like birds and stuff that use tools
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
to do things. And in fact, even use tools in such a way that can modify their environments in the same way that humans did in the
Mhm.
past. Um,
Mhm.
no one is going
Mhm.
to say that there's chimpanzees out there making rockets. Like it's ridiculous.
Mhm.
But they definitely use tools, right? Like they'll use
Mhm.
sticks to stab monkeys and like make little
Mhm.
monkey shish kebabs and eat them.
Yes, they will hunt monkeys with spears,
Oh yeah.
and the tools that they use are more expansive than I think that we realize. I will give credit where credit due. My good friend and colleague Susanna Carvalho was probably at the forefront of developing this idea of an archaeology of primates. What is the material record that they leave behind? And this has subsequently been taken on by a lot of different people. But that this idea that you can actually see a material record of these behaviors is actually really interesting because of the fact that we tend to, especially in my line of work, look for things that we think are uniquely human. And it's now very clear that the things that we find in the archaeological record, the distinguishing features between what's uniquely human and what's shared with primates is a lot muddier than we thought it was, right? And that primates produce and use a variety of tools, and some of them leave behind records of that. And the really exciting thing about that is that we tend to use modern ethnographic examples as our sort of analog for understanding the past. But in fact, for the early parts of the fossil record, the primates are probably just as useful, if not more useful, as an analog. And we can observe them, and we can actually observe them producing a record, right? Well, we can for now, as long as we could keep their numbers up. But that ability to see how tool use impacts not only ecosystems that those primates live in, but also the record that they leave behind associated with that is super interesting. One of my former student and now postdoc at the Max Planck Institute just published a paper about how the movement of stones around the landscape actually makes more resources available for chimpanzees that are cracking nuts. And so the ability for them to move rocks around actually expands their ability to access more resources. So I mean, they are, by just moving rocks around, really expanding their capacity to access more resources in the landscape. So their just redistribution of where rocks are actually has an impact on what kind of aspects of the ecosystem are available to them. So, I mean, that would be a very loose description of what niche construction is, but it is really, you're modifying the ecosystem and that affects how you're adapting to it because more parts of the landscape are now available to you. So in that way, I mean, chimpanzees and, as I mentioned, macaques are really, they impact their ecosystems quite substantially, even with very limited technology. And so, understanding how those things are interrelated is more important than we think we gave it credit to before. So
For sure. But no, secondly, the macaque example, we actually, you told me about that before we started recording. Can you share what that is?
yeah, so that's a really interesting work by my colleagues at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. Lydia Luntz and her group there have actually documented that macaques use tools throughout Southeast Asia. Very specific species of use them. They use them to access a variety of shellfish, and since many of these populations are sort of effectively stranded on islands, they use them to access the resources on those islands. And sometimes they actually wipe out the entirety of the shellfish population on those islands. And then, of course, have to modify their tool use to access something else because they can no longer access the shellfish. And we're now actually working on what is the sort of material record of that, because you can actually see the impact of the size of the shellfish on different islands based on how frequently macaques are actually using those spaces. So this is, an example, and also interestingly, an archaeologically preserved one, right? Because the record of the sort of shrinking of shellfish size is something we often associate with humans, but now we can see that this is happening even when just a primate is using tool use to do the same thing. And so I think it gives us a great analog for, if macaques are doing this on islands in the present day, and their population is certainly smaller than it used to be, what is the impact of larger groups of hominins all over accessing a variety of resources that we have not yet, we don't, we have cut marks on bones, we have stone tools, and we sometimes assume that those are the only two things that hominins are doing. Couldn't be further from the case as far as I'm concerned. Watching chimpanzees, even for a very brief time that I was able to spend, you can see they access everything, right? They're constantly finding new ways to access different resources in their ecosystem. I'm sure hominids were doing the same thing. So, what are all the different things that they're accessing? How is that impacting the ecosystems that they live in? Is, I think, a question we haven't really tapped into. We tend to think about humans as like, okay, hunters, they killed off the mammoth. That's why certain ecosystems are the way they are, and certainly that is the case for later time frames. What they were doing 100,000 years ago, 500,000 years, 5 million years ago is something I think we haven't really wrapped our head around.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the question becomes, how do you tease out changes that are from hominins versus things that
Mhm.
would have happened anyway on their own?
Right.
And
Hmm.
then also understanding what were the long-term effects of those changes.
Hmm.
I think one of the things that someone who doesn't care about science might ask, I don't know why you're listening to the show if that's the case,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
someone might ask is like, why should we care about this?
Right. Yeah. I know it's a great question. I mean, it's a thing that we often think about for, why spend taxpayer money on this kind of a thing. And I think that, there's two aspects of it. One is the sort of conservation aspect of it, when we often talk about this idea of like, what are we trying to preserve and what are we preserving, right? What is it, we know that we're causing mass extinction events all over the planet. We know that we're modifying ecosystems, making it unlivable for lots of different species. But if we can't sort of turn back the time and reverse to an original habitat, because there is none, right? That isn't a thing. But so instead, what should we think about? How can we preserve the structure of ecosystems? Is that something that we can do? And what will that look like? And where do we put our efforts to do that? And the other thing is really trying to figure out sort of what is it that make what humans are distinctly different from all other species on the planet. I mean, I know it's faux pas to say that, and one of my favorite books was the Robert Foley's Another Unique Species, about how really the sort of setting humans aside as sort of distinctly different from the rest of the animal kingdom makes us ask the wrong question. I think he's right about that, but there are really distinct features, right? We exist in all ecosystems in almost all latitudes. We exist in extraordinarily high densities. We modify the heck out of any ecosystems we live in. But how did we get to that place? Because if you were to, turn back the clock only 5 million years ago, we represent a very small proportion of the planet, right? So small that it's really difficult for us to find any evidence of it. So how do we go from, effectively a relatively inconspicuous ape, somewhere in Eurasia or Africa and Eurasia, to basically the most dominant species in almost every ecosystem on the planet. No, understanding how that happens is, I think, important for understanding sort of who we are and the sort of distinctive features of our lineage. And I think that that is an important feature because it gets into the aspects of sort of, you know, what actually makes us all the same, what makes us, why are the differences between us sometimes highlighted, although our similarities are actually far greater than our differences? And what are those sort of distinctively human features that make us so distinct from the rest of the animal kingdom? And I think the confluence of both tool use, technology, and our impact on ecosystems really is that feature that makes us distinct. And so that's why, at least why I have focused so much of my time on trying to sort of answer that question is like, when do we become distinct? And what is it about us that becomes so distinct that changes really our evolutionary trajectory from there on? Because it really is, I think once humans have passed a threshold where what we refer to as cumulative culture, this ability to basically transfer information with high fidelity, keep that information as a store of information within the groups that we live in, which is the basis behind culture and the diversity we see in modern peoples. That is the turning point at which there's really no going back. Our evolutionary trajectory doesn't ever go back, right? It just becomes more and more accelerated from that point on. But I can say pretty confidently, although I'm not sure that this can be agreed upon by anybody else, that we don't know when that is, right? I think lots of people will point to different places, but I'm not necessarily sure why they would say so. Because nothing, there's no point that you can point to in our evolutionary history where we can say, yeah, that's the point, and after that we have cumulative culture. There's various arguments for different places, but I don't think any of them is definitive right now. So
Yeah. You're asking a lot of really big questions. And I think a lot of the questions that make people interested in anthropology, you know what I mean? Like, what
yeah.
is it to be human? When did that
Hmm.
happen? Why did that happen? How has that affected the things around us? Um,
Hmm.
how humans as animals, like, what does that mean? Humans as humans, what does that mean?
Hmm.
And then also just questions about climate and our environment. It's a lot of really difficult questions to answer. And this is something that you see a lot, especially in paleo stuff, where you're trying to understand a world that no longer exists.
Yeah.
And like, how do you assure yourself that the conclusions that you're coming to are accurate? And at least you're working with environments, right? As opposed to
Hmm.
some paleoanthropologists that are like, I have this single specimen,
Yeah.
which makes it even harder. But it's
Hmm.
definitely a huge amount of work that you've signed up for.
Yeah.
And I'm very
Yeah.
excited to follow it and see what comes of it, because as we were chatting ahead of the show, and one of the things you mentioned is that with COVID, a lot of this research has been kind of put on hold until
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
knows.
Yeah. We've had a lot of time to think about all the things we want to do, but not a whole lot of time to actually do it. So, but yeah, I mean, and the exciting thing is that one of the things I also mentioned is this idea that the barriers between fields are starting to break down, and things that we thought for sure we knew, for example, like we thought that the earliest tools associated with our lineage were 2.5 or 2, that was, we kind of assumed that since the 1970s. And it turns out we might be wrong, that now there's probably tools that go back as old as 3 and 3.3 million years ago, although that's controversial. But a lot of these, just like we used to think that humans really don't have an impact on their ecosystem and on their environments until sort of either the industrial revolution or the last 10,000 years. But I think even really great work being done in the Americas and also in Europe as well as in Africa has shown that no, I mean we know even small groups of hunter gatherers are really having an impact on the ecosystem. So I think a lot of the sort of standard what we know has been kind of twisted on its head. So I'm excited about the kind of work that we're going to be doing in the future, and the field as a whole, as long as we can actually do some of the.
For sure, for sure. Yeah. I feel like I could talk to you all day about this. And I probably would, as I had mentioned earlier, because I like to talk to people. That's why I have my own podcast. But I want to
Great.
be cognizant of your time, and so it's time for the last three questions of the interview.
Okay.
The first question is if someone wanted to learn more about what you do or your field of study, where would be a good place for them to start?
Oh, okay. I would say, okay, so I mean, if they wanted to learn more about our research project, I think they should go to our website, the Center for the Advanced Study of Human Paleobiology. We have a pretty extensive website. My lab I share with Professor Allison Brooks. We're the Stone Age Archaeology Group. And from there, you can also find about something I didn't get to talk about today, but something I'm also very passionate about, which is training young people, especially people from underrepresented groups, associated with the Kubi4 Research and Training Program. We're the longest running training program in the study of human history, going back 35 years now, although I've not been running it for 35 years. But yeah, I mean, there you can learn a lot about that. I would also say that the various different organizations have fantastic outreach components. So the Smithsonian's Human Origins Program, the American Museum of Natural History, I'll give a shout out to a good colleague, Francis Forrest, who's the outreach coordinator there and does a fantastic job. I think both of those places are doing a really good job of getting the word out. And the Institute of Human Origins has a wonderful website that provides information about early human history and aspects, especially the intersection between climate change and that, because they do a lot of great work on that.
Awesome. Those are all really good resources.
Mm.
Thank you. Second question, what are you reading for work right now?
Oh, what am I reading for work right now? Today, I was reading a paper, really interesting paper by a group. First off, there's a guy named Manuel Will. He's at the University of Tübingen, and it's kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier about this idea of we're starting to get into how do we ask really big questions. And this is paper in Scientific Reports, I believe, looking at the relationship between brain size, body size, and different environmental variables. We have lots of hypotheses about how these happen, but many of them start off with a basic premise and then very scant data. And so as the data increases, is there actually what's the best evidence to support these different hypotheses? And so, I mean, I think it's part of the way in which paleoanthropology, we used to be a science that was kind of, I don't know, I think we were just sort of a curiosity and, was a bone here, a bone there, kind of nothing. And now we're really getting into huge genetic data sets, tremendous environmental data sets, big amounts of information about the past, and we can start to piece these things together. And I think Manuel will actually, I don't know, I can't say about the conclusions of the study, but the fact that he's asking these really big questions is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've harped on since the beginning of the show, but if you like anthropology, it's probably pretty important for you to start studying math because that's going to be
Oh, yeah.
a big part of the field going forward.
Yeah, you're not doing it without that anymore.
Yeah, for sure. And math is it's not as scary as everyone thinks it is. It can be a good time. It can be a horrible time
Yeah.
too, but it can be a good time.
Yeah.
And then third and final question, which is what are you consuming for fun right now?
Actually, the last couple of days, I one of my friends recently got me into Ted Lasso, and I hadn't seen it before, and man, I'm definitely hooked on it. I have to say, like, it's like Halloween candy right now. I have to tell myself, like, okay, I'll watch two of these, but I cannot do it any further because I will just spend the rest of the day. But what a great resource for our time right now. Is a sort of much needed, I would say, sort of brain candy in a time when we all feeling a lot of stress right now. So
It's so funny because I feel like I somehow totally managed to miss all of the Ted Lasso stuff. And then suddenly at Halloween, I was like, who is everyone? What? Who is Ted
yeah,
Lasso? I don't understand what's happening.
yeah. But I feel like it is a piece of media content that has really found its time, right? Everyone really could use a therapist right now, and he's basically a therapist for modern media consumers. So
Well, thank you so much for your time. If you ever want to come back, you're more than welcome to.
sure, sure, absolutely,
And I
yeah.
hope you have
Thanks.
a wonderful day.
Yeah, you too. Yeah.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthropology podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthropology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthropology.com. This show is produced by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.